Welcome, everyone. I'm Antoine Buyse, a professor of human rights at Utrecht University.
And I'm Lorena Sosa, I'm assistant professor in human rights at Utrecht University.
Nice to talk to you today, Lorena, and we are going to reflect a bit on the public protest during the pandemic, especially from a human rights perspective, which is our expertise. And I think many people were asking themselves what was happening with all the protests. And we all know the example in many countries where people were applauding from their balconies the healthcare workers. Were those a demonstration or just an act of support? And it's interesting to see that the same balconies were used, for example, in Brazil to protest against the government, where people were not clapping hands, but clapping pots and pans to raise their voice against the President Bolsonaro's basically denial of the pandemic policies. So that, but also, of course, the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which spread very rapidly in the last few weeks, the anti-lockdown demonstrations in many countries, they are all showing that the protests are back in the streets, in spite of maybe the health dangers, even in countries where the pandemic is really raging on still a lot. And for us, from a human rights perspective, this is a fascinating thing to see because basically the right to protest is not absolute, so it can be limited, and it has to be weighed against other human rights, including, of course, in this case, the right to health. Is it safe enough to go outside, or should that be basically prohibited? So there are clashes there, potential clashes at least, and tensions. And Lorena, you have been thinking about this as well. What are some of the problems there that you see?
Yes, indeed. So to me, like you were saying, it has been very interesting to see these developments unfold and how the different measures and the dynamics that have been triggered by the epidemic highlight or flashes out some of the dimensions of this tension that you were mentioning between the restriction of freedom of assembly and the right to protest in relation to the protection of public health. And I think one of the areas that trigger my interest or my curiosity is how suddenly we become aware of the relevance of the purpose or the underlying causes of the protest. Because as you were saying, we have seen very different and diverse types of protests. And in normal times, we pay no attention to what is the discourse, what is the reason under the protest. But in this case, we have from anti-lockdown protests to, like you were saying, protest in relation to Black Lives Matter. So suddenly we become aware, and also because it's under the scrutiny. So we see it on our screens. We are following how the epidemic is evolving, what are the measures that states are taking. So one of my questions is actually that. So what happens? How will this awareness of the different types of demonstrations that we see impact on the way that we assess these limitations and how we tolerate in human rights law limitations to the right to assembly and the right to protest? And that's, I don't know how you how do you think it might impact our assessments?
Yeah, this is important because in normal times we have only a few outer limits to expressions and what you can say during public demonstrations. Of course, you cannot incite to violence or hatred. But now, indeed, more the content seems to play a role, and it seems to interact us also with how the demonstrations are happening. So I think many people in the Netherlands, for example, have seen in the news that this weekend there were big demonstrations on the Malieveld, which is kind of the national podium in the Netherlands for protests. And some of it turned violent at the end of the day. And these were protests against the pandemic measures, against the social distancing, but then were partly overtaken by apparently football hooligans, something which we in social sciences call spoilers of a social movement, which then very much color how public opinion sees those demonstrations. And that's a problem, of course, also with some of the Black Lives Matter protests. If there's a little bit of looting or a lot of looting in the evening or at night, then the whole protest gets framed as being dangerous or should be prohibited. So there we see that in these times, this link between the content of the demonstration and how it happens tends to get blurred a bit in an uneasy way, to say the least. And I was curious because you mentioned these different types of protests that we now see. Are those very different in that sense during the pandemic? Some of them are, of course, related directly to the pandemic, but you mentioned some other types of protests that are coming back now in a way.
Yeah, so I think it is interesting first to distinguish the scenario that was before the pandemic as well. So before the pandemic, it was a very active scenario. We saw demonstrations spanning from every corner, from Chile to Hong Kong to Haiti. So we could see that there were demonstrations taking place that suddenly came to a stop, to a halt, with all these measures were put in place, all the different lockdowns were put in place. But I also think that if we see these new or emerging forms of demonstration, or the reconfiguration of those demonstrations that have been taking place for quite some time already, I think I tend to see sort of three types of demonstrations. First, we have the anti-lockdown type of demonstrations where it's about the protection of individual freedoms and against the increasing power of the government. And we can see those, which I think is also very striking, because we can see those from the US to Mexico or Argentina or Spain and Germany. So you see all these different anti-lockdown measures claiming for more freedoms. But on the other hand, you also see demonstrations that are more related to basically subsistence during this pandemic and coping with the lockdown measures and the limitations. And this goes from people being fired or the lack of protection of instruments of protection for those who have to continue working, for example, or basically just subsistence issues, how the people can access right to food or health attention, or and you can see that this is also geographically differs, because in the south, for example, in the global south, you can see that a lot of the employment is irregular employment, and these are the first to be fired as well. These workers are the first to be fired, or you can see that essential workers who are normally care personnel also has a lot of limitations, insecurities in terms of labor, less protection, and also instruments protection. So I think this is very interesting. And of course, the third type of demonstrations that I see are those related to police brutality, as you were saying. So ranging from Black Lives Matter, but also the connection between police abuse and ethnic or racial profiling that we see so strong, and that actually was discussed in one of the series in these conversations. I think it's the third type of demonstrations that we see. And this is not really new. This is just how the pandemic emphasizes and highlights some of the systemic difficulties that we deal with.
Yeah, and I think this is also quite striking that you have these protests that are colored by the unequal impact of the anti-pandemic measures. And that kind of echoes the inequalities that are at the roots of some of the other protests, such as the Black Lives Matter protests, or even the protests against corruption or social justice that were part of the earlier global protest move. So here again, we see that any government measure hits people unequally, and that is also reflected in the protests. Maybe you can say a bit more about that, because you were talking about these anti-racism protests as one of the strands, but we only see what is above the sea level there. We only see the protests themselves. But can you say a bit more about what is underlying those?
Well, I think it's very clear when we talk about police abuse. It's very clear the racism in this, the intrinsic or the systematic racism is more easily seen. But when we talk about, for example, the demonstrations that we saw in relation to being fired, this is also something that has a racialized impact, I think, because if we consider who are the person, for example, working on this in these irregular situations, it's normally people with a minority background or straight migrants. And the same goes for care personnel. Here in Europe, for example, it's very easily seen that in Spain, in Italy, you can see that, for example, nurses come from certain countries, or domestic workers. So this has a racialized and also gender aspect to it as well. Yeah. So women and women with certain backgrounds are very much vulnerable in these situations, and that is also part of this inequality that is rooted in the system. That is there, it's rooted in the systems. It's just that somehow now it becomes very, very evident.
And I think people don't even realize when they kind of applaud the healthcare system that is indeed then reflecting in itself, this healthcare system, some of those differences. Yes, that they don't see normally because they don't pay attention to it.
No, and exactly. The healthcare system is not only the doctor, it's the nurse, and it's the cleaning personnel, and it's everybody else sustaining.
Essential occupations, as we now call them. Yeah. And then another aspect, maybe as a last one, is how people demonstrate, that people also get increasingly creative because of the lockdown measures, but they were also creative before that. And of course, in some countries, it's almost entirely prohibited to do any protests. So it fascinated me to see then the creativity of people. So in Russia, what you could see, for example, is that people did standalone protests because they couldn't gather, assemble together, or they traveled in the metro with a bag with their political message on their bag. So they just took a little walk and protested. But they also turned online. And there was an interesting example there that from April onwards, people in Russia started to use an app which was called Yandex, and it was basically normally used for traffic jams, where people could indicate on an online map, I see a traffic jam here and here, and just to alert other drivers. And they used that now to protest against government buildings. So they just put their little pegs on the map and said, I'm here and I'm against this government or this local city mayor, etc. So they kind of made an online protest because a real protest was impossible. Yeah. And I think this online offline interaction that's something we see much more often. But also there we have inequalities because not everyone has good online access. And you have also looked a bit into that.
Yes, and I think that's certainly the case, and you could see the first inequality perhaps emerges in relation to education. We had to face it, having students from different places, whether they would have access and the level of access they would have to internet. So considering what we are giving, what we are not given. But I think it also highlights not only the access, and the ability to use digital technologies in general. And highlighting some of the most obvious aspects, I think, is how it would, the human rights aspect to this in relation to, for example, the elderly would emphasize the possibility for elderly people to remain autonomous, to have access to the internet, know how to use it, do shopping online, just establish communication with family members during this lockdown has been really important. So something that was before a sort of a luxury to think about internet as a human right or access to digital technology, under these circumstances it becomes very clear that this generates an inequality in relation to people as well. When we think about children, the protection of children in the internet from potential predators as well. So all of these aspects are again highlighted, I think, by this need for digital technologies in order for us to express, to complain, to protest, to communicate.
Yes, yeah, so the offline problems reoccur online too. So what we can for sure conclude is that all these protests are here to stay. Maybe they were slowed down a bit by the pandemic, but they are really coming back. And some social movements have really been galvanized by it as well. It was nice to philosophize a bit about this. And thank you everyone for listening.